In 2001, a sales representative for Purdue Pharma walked into a doctor's office in Appalachia and left behind a coupon. 30 days of OxyContin, free of charge. The doctor handed it to a patient with a bad back. That patient handed it to his son. His son was dead within 2 years. That sales rep answered to a company. That company answered to a family. And that family, the Sacklers of New York, had by then already collected over $1 billion from the drug that would eventually kill more than 500,000 Americans. They built hospitals, they named museums, they endowed universities. Harvard, Oxford, the Louvre. Their name is carved into stone on 4 continents. What's not carved anywhere is the number of people who died so those buildings could go up. This is the story of the Sackler family and what it cost. Brooklyn, 1913. Isaac Sackler, a Jewish immigrant from Galicia, ran a grocery store on the edge of poverty in Flatbush. When the Depression hit, the store went under. The family moved into cramped quarters on the edge of respectability. But Isaac had 3 sons, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond. And those 3 boys had something that couldn't be taken away by any economic collapse. They were relentless. Arthur was the eldest, and from the beginning, the one who saw the angle others missed. He put himself through medical school, working as a waiter and a busboy. He graduated from New York University's College of Medicine in 1937 and immediately began doing something unusual for a physician. He started thinking like a businessman. His 2 younger brothers followed him into medicine. Mortimer and Raymond both became doctors, both trained in psychiatry, and both watched closely as Arthur developed what would become the family's true engine of wealth. Not science, but marketing. In 1942, Arthur took a job at a small advertising agency called William Douglas McAdams. Within a few years, he had effectively taken it over. He transformed pharmaceutical advertising from a modest, technical affair into an aggressive, doctor-targeting industry. He pioneered the use of medical journals as advertising platforms. He figured out that if you could convince a physician, not the patient, but the physician, that a drug was safe, effective, and modern, you could sell that drug to almost anyone. His first major success was Librium, then Valium, both manufactured by Roche. Arthur's campaigns for Valium turned it into the most prescribed drug in the United States by the early 1960s. He didn't just advertise a pill. He sold a diagnosis. He convinced an entire generation of American doctors that anxiety was undermedicated, that housewives and businessmen and anyone feeling the weight of modern life deserved pharmaceutical relief. The playbook worked beyond anything Roche had imagined. Meanwhile, in 1952, the 3 brothers pooled their savings and purchased a small, struggling pharmaceutical company in Greenwich, Connecticut called Purdue Frederick. It was a minor operation selling laxatives and earwax removers. Most people would have seen nothing there. Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond saw a platform. They didn't advertise the acquisition. They didn't issue press releases. The family has always understood that the best power is quiet power. Arthur would remain largely separate from Purdue Frederick's operations. He had his advertising empire, his art collections, his philanthropic maneuvering. But Mortimer and Raymond built the company steadily through the 1960s and 70s, waiting for the right moment, the right product, the right market conditions. They would wait 30 years. When the moment came, they would not waste it. By the 1970s, the Sackler family had money, real money. Arthur's advertising innovations had made him extraordinarily wealthy, and his brother's pharmaceutical company, while not yet a household name, was profitable and growing. But Arthur was building something else alongside the wealth: a reputation. He gave generously, strategically, and always with conditions. He donated the Sackler Gallery to the Smithsonian. He funded a wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He gave to Oxford, to Harvard, to the Royal Academy. His name went up on buildings across the world. Each donation a calculated piece of social architecture. The Sacklers were ascending, and they understood, better than almost any other family of their era, that in America there is a direct conversion rate between money and respectability. Arthur died in 1987, before OxyContin existed. His heirs sold his stake in Purdue to Mortimer and Raymond's branch of the family. But everything Arthur had built, the marketing philosophy, the institutional reputation, the playbook for turning a drug into a cultural necessity, that remained. Raymond's son, Richard Sackler, began taking a more active role in Purdue Frederick through the 1980s. He had his grandfather's drive and his great-uncle Arthur's eye for opportunity. He watched the pharmaceutical market carefully, and what he saw in the mid-1980s was a gap. Pain was undertreated. That was the argument, and it wasn't entirely wrong. Cancer patients in genuine agony were sometimes denied adequate medication because physicians feared addiction and regulatory scrutiny. A legitimate medical conversation was happening about whether Americans were suffering unnecessarily. Richard Sackler and Purdue's leadership watched that conversation and saw something else. A market. In 1984, Purdue released MS-Contin, a controlled-release morphine tablet for cancer patients. It was a genuine pharmaceutical innovation. By releasing the drug slowly over 12 hours, rather than all at once, it provided more consistent pain relief. It was also profitable, and it taught Purdue's team something important. Doctors would prescribe strong opioids if you gave them permission to feel good about it. The next step was obvious, at least from inside Purdue's Connecticut headquarters. Take the controlled release mechanism, apply it to oxycodone, a compound that had been around since 1916, but had never achieved major commercial success. Market it not just to cancer patients, but to the far larger population of people with chronic pain, bad backs, arthritis, fibromyalgia, injuries that never quite healed, name it OxyContin. Purdue hired teams of chemists and conducted the research. They applied for FDA approval, and they prepared a marketing campaign that Arthur Sackler himself would have recognized and admired. The key to the campaign was a single claim. Purdue told doctors and told the FDA and told the medical community that OxyContin's controlled release formula meant it was less addictive than other opioids. The drug released steadily. There was no spike of euphoria, they said. Therefore, the addiction risk was lower. This claim rested on thin evidence. The primary study supporting it involved only 38 patients, but it was enough to get language into the package insert, suggesting the drug had a low potential for abuse. That language became the cornerstone of everything that followed. When OxyContin received FDA approval in 1995, Purdue was ready. They had assembled a sales force larger than any the company had ever deployed. 500 representatives in the first year, growing rapidly. These representatives carried with them starter coupons for free prescriptions, samples, and an intensive training program built on one central message. This drug is different. This drug is safer. Your patients deserve this. The sales team targeted general practitioners, not just pain specialists, not just oncologists, but family doctors and internists across rural America, across the Midwest, across Appalachia. They targeted areas with high rates of physical labor, high rates of injury, communities where backs gave out early and people worked through pain until the pain became unbearable In internal documents that would later become central to federal litigation, Purdue executives tracked prescriptions by territory with extraordinary precision. They knew which doctors were writing the most scripts. They rewarded sales representatives who grew prescription numbers in their regions. Bonuses ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Richard Sackler watched the numbers climb. In an email from 1997, he wrote that Purdue should be poised to expand its market. The wording was clinical. The ambition was not. In its first year of sales, OxyContin generated $45 million in revenue. By 1999, that number had reached $1 billion. By 2001, it had doubled. The Sackler family was becoming one of the wealthiest in America, and almost no one outside of pharmaceutical circles knew their name. That was entirely by design. The first sign that something was wrong came from a small town in Virginia. Lee County sits in the far southwestern corner of the state, tucked into the Appalachian coalfields. By the late 1990s, the mines had been closing for a decade. Men who had spent their lives doing hard physical work, digging coal, cutting timber, hauling loads, had backs and knees that reflected those years. Chronic pain was not a lifestyle complaint in Lee County. It was a reality of aging in a place built on physical labor. When OxyContin arrived at the local pharmacies in 1996, it moved quickly. Doctors who had been cautious about prescribing strong opioids found themselves presented with Purdue's message. This is different. This is safer. Your patients deserve relief. They wrote prescriptions. Pharmacies filled them. Patients experienced genuine pain relief. At first, the problem with OxyContin, which Purdue's scientists absolutely understood, and which would later be central to litigation against the company, was that the controlled release mechanism could be defeated. Crushing a pill before swallowing it, or dissolving it in water to inject it, released the full dose of oxycodone at once. The 12-hour slow release became a single, powerful surge. The high was intense. The drug was addictive. And in Lee County and the surrounding region, people figured this out quickly. By 1999, emergency rooms in rural Virginia and Kentucky were reporting patterns they had never seen before. Not heroin overdoses. Those were an urban story, associated with needles and cities and visible poverty. These were people with prescription bottles, housewives, factory workers, teenagers who found their parents' pills. The demographic profile of opioid addiction was shifting in real time, and the epicenter was Appalachia. In 2000, the DEA office in Bristol, Virginia, began tracking the problem formally. They found that OxyContin prescriptions in their territory were wildly out of proportion to the population. They found pain clinics that were essentially prescription mills, doctors writing hundreds of scripts per day with minimal examination. They found pharmacies struggling to keep the drug in stock. They also found, in internal Purdue communications obtained through early legal proceedings, evidence that the company knew. A 1999 internal report from Purdue's own researchers acknowledged what they called diversion, the non-medical use of OxyContin. Sales representatives were reporting back from the field that the drug was being sold on the street. Some reps had flagged specific doctors who seemed to be running pill mills. The response from Purdue's management was not to curtail sales. It was to continue growing them while managing the public relations problem. This is the moment that transforms the Sackler story from a tale of reckless capitalism into something more deliberate. Richard Sackler received briefings on the abuse patterns. Other senior family members who sat on Purdue's board were aware of the emerging crisis. They hired consultants to track media coverage of OxyContin abuse. They deployed a strategy of aggressive denial. publicly insisting that addiction was the problem of people who misused the drug, not of the drug itself. In a 2001 speech to a sales conference, Richard Sackler spoke about the emerging abuse crisis. He called addicts the culprits and dismissed concerns about the drug's safety profile. He urged the sales force to stay aggressive. Meanwhile, deaths were accumulating. In West Virginia, a state that would eventually file one of the most significant lawsuits against the opioid industry, the numbers were already catastrophic by 2001. McDowell County, one of the poorest counties in the country, was being buried. Coroners were filing overdose reports with a regularity that felt unreal in peacetime America. Families were losing multiple members. Communities built around physical labor and tight social networks were fraying at speeds that social scientists would later study and struggle to explain. The Sackler family's response to this was a public one and a private one, and they were very different. Publicly, Purdue insisted its drug was safe when used as directed. The company spent millions on what it called educational programs about responsible prescribing. It created a hotline. It produced materials about safe storage and disposal. These efforts were real in the sense that they existed. They were largely theatrical, in the sense that they were dwarfed by the marketing budget and specifically designed to create legal distance between the company and the consequences of its product. Privately, the family was extracting money from the company at extraordinary rates. Court documents unsealed during Massachusetts litigation against the Sacklers revealed the internal financial mechanics with startling clarity. Between 2007 and 2018, the Sackler family withdrew approximately $10 to $12 billion from Purdue Pharma. These withdrawals were not ordinary dividends paid through corporate governance. Many of them were structured payments specifically designed to move money out of the company and into family trusts and personal accounts. The family's own lawyers, in internal emails, referred to the withdrawals during a critical period. After litigation risk became apparent, as part of a strategy to protect assets, they recommended moving money quickly. They discussed the timing of transfers relative to potential legal judgments. These were not the actions of a family that believed its company had done nothing wrong. OxyContin continued to sell through the early 2000s. The sales force continued to grow, and in communities across rural America, the crisis deepened. In 2001, West Virginia recorded 295 overdose deaths. That number would climb every year for the next decade. In Kentucky, in Tennessee, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, the curve followed the same trajectory. Medical examiners developed protocols for opioid overdoses that they had never needed before. Emergency rooms stocked naloxone in quantities that would have seemed absurd 10 years earlier. The Sacklers' name appeared nowhere in these statistics. It appeared on museum wings and hospital buildings. It appeared on donor rolls at prestigious universities. It appeared in society pages and philanthropic announcements. The distance between those two realities, the dying in Appalachia and the donors in Manhattan, is not accidental. It was built, maintained, and defended with the same precision the family applied to its marketing campaigns. Purdue Pharma's sales operation in the late 1990s and early 2000s was one of the most sophisticated pharmaceutical marketing machines ever assembled. Understanding it requires setting aside the comfortable idea that opioid overprescribing happened because doctors were fooled. Some were, but the system Purdue built was designed to make informed caution professionally and financially uncomfortable for physicians. The foundation was data. Purdue purchased prescription data from companies that tracked doctor by doctor prescribing patterns across America. They knew, in real time, which physicians in any given zip code were high prescribers and which were cautious. They mapped these patterns onto sales territories and directed their representatives to concentrate resources where the opportunity was greatest. Sales representatives earned base salaries that were competitive but unremarkable. Their bonuses were not. The commission structure at Purdue was built around prescription growth. In years when the drug was expanding rapidly, representatives in high prescribing territories could earn bonus checks in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. A successful representative selling OxyContin in a rural Appalachian territory in 2000 could earn more than most of the physicians they were visiting. This created an incentive structure with no break. The representatives were trained extensively. They learned to handle the addiction objection, the concern a cautious doctor might raise about a powerful opioid, with a specific response built around the controlled release mechanism and the thin evidence that had made it into the package insert. They learned to move conversations away from risk and toward what Purdue called undertreated pain. They brought food. They sponsored dinners at local restaurants for medical staff. They funded educational trips for physicians, conferences in resort locations where the agenda included presentations about chronic pain management and the benefits of OxyContin. These were legal activities. They were also, transparently, entertainment designed to build relationships and create reciprocal obligation. In cities, this approach faced more resistance. Urban academic medical centers had ethics committees and institutional protocols. Specialists had access to more information and more peer review. The Purdue model found its most fertile ground in rural America, where solo practitioners or small practices were often the only medical resource for communities spread across large geographic areas. These doctors had less institutional support, more patients with genuine chronic pain, and now a pharmaceutical representative coming through the door with a compelling message and a generous per diem. The targeting of these communities was not accidental. Internal Purdue documents revealed that the company specifically analyzed which areas had the highest concentrations of physical laborers, coal miners, construction workers, agricultural workers, and directed resources accordingly. The correlation between physically demanding occupations, chronic pain, and opioid vulnerability was understood inside Purdue long before it became a public health conversation. The company also understood the cultural dimensions of the communities they were targeting. Appalachian and rural Midwestern communities had deep suspicion of government, strong traditions of self-reliance, and limited access to mental health services. They also had, in the late 1990s, significant economic distress. The deindustrialization that had hollowed out manufacturing communities across the country left behind not only unemployment, but the psychological weight of lost identity and purpose. Purdue never marketed OxyContin as a solution to despair. They didn't need to. The drug did that on its own. When opioids work, and they do work, for pain, they also create a sense of warmth and well-being that goes beyond the relief of physical symptoms. For someone in chronic pain who is also economically stressed, socially isolated, and psychologically struggling, that feeling is not just pleasant. It is for a period transformative. And when the drug becomes addictive, when the body adjusts to its presence and begins to require it, the withdrawal is not just physical, it is the loss of the only thing that made things feel manageable. This is the mechanism of opioid addiction in communities that were already struggling. Purdue didn't create the economic despair of Appalachia. They found it and used it. By 2002, Purdue had become one of the most profitable pharmaceutical companies in America on the basis of a single drug. OxyContin accounted for more than 80% of the company's revenue. The Sackler family's personal wealth had crossed the billion-dollar threshold for individual family members. Arthur's branch of the family, his heirs and their descendants, retained their share of the company's profits through the structure Arthur himself had established. Mortimer's side and Raymond's side each controlled their portions. The family was divided internally into what documents called Side A and Side B, but both sides were enriched by the same source. They continued giving. Between 1995 and 2007, the Sackler family donated hundreds of millions of dollars to cultural and educational institutions, the Serpentine Gallery in London, the Tate Modern, the Guggenheim, institutions that hadn't been in the family's orbit before OxyContin found themselves courted with gifts that transformed their endowments and put the Sackler name on buildings that millions of people walked through every year. This is not coincidental generosity. It is how certain families have always managed the conversion of money into standing. The Rockefellers understood it. The Carnegies understood it. You build something visible and permanent, attach your name to it, and the name accumulates the associations of the building rather than the associations of the business. For the Sacklers, the philanthropy served a specific function. It placed them among the class of old, respectable American money, with all the assumptions of legitimacy that came with that placement. It worked for a remarkably long time. As late as 2010, the Sackler name was associated in the public mind primarily with art and medicine and education. OxyContin was known to health policy experts and law enforcement officials and the devastated communities of rural America. But the Sacklers themselves, the family, the donors, the names on the museum wings, were largely invisible in the public narrative. That would change. But it would take a body count that, by any measure, should never have been reached. In 2007, Purdue Frederick, the parent company of Purdue Pharma, pleaded guilty to federal criminal charges for misbranding OxyContin with intent to defraud and mislead. 3 executives pleaded guilty as individuals. The company paid $600 million in fines. For most companies, a criminal guilty plea would be a civilizational event. For Purdue, it was a speed bump. The fine was significant but survivable. The guilty plea was to a subsidiary, not the main company. No Sackler family member was charged. No one went to prison. And within weeks of the settlement, Purdue's sales force was back on the road. The drug kept selling, the money kept flowing, and the family kept giving. The numbers that define the American opioid crisis are large enough to have become abstract. 500,000 dead since 1999. That is the figure most commonly cited. 500,000 people whose deaths are attributed directly to opioid overdose across a quarter century. It is larger than the American death toll in World War II. The abstraction is its own kind of problem. Numbers at that scale stop being people and become statistics. And once they become statistics, they can be debated, qualified, and eventually absorbed into the background noise of policy discussion. The people were not abstract. In Huntington, West Virginia, a small city on the Ohio River that became one of the most visible symbols of the opioid crisis, there was an afternoon in August 2016 when 28 people overdosed in a 4-hour window. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Paramedics who had carried naloxone as a just-in-case measure for years found themselves burning through their supply in a single shift. The scene was described by first responders as unlike anything they had experienced in decades of work. Not a disaster, not a flood or a crash or an explosion, but something slower and more systematic. A community consuming itself. Huntington had 49,000 residents. Its overdose rate was among the highest of any city in America. Its poverty rate was among the highest as well. The two facts are not separable. Appalachia was the first region where the crisis became undeniable, but it was never the only one. As the 2000s progressed, the opioid epidemic spread beyond the coalfields and into suburbs, into cities, into demographics that hadn't previously been associated with addiction. New England, the Midwest, the Southwest, the spread followed the prescription patterns, where doctors had been targeted by Purdue's sales force and had written liberally, addiction followed. When people became addicted to prescription opioids and the prescriptions became harder to obtain, as states began implementing monitoring programs and physicians became more cautious, many users transitioned to heroin, which was cheaper, and after about 2013, increasingly laced with illicitly manufactured fentanyl. The prescription opioid crisis created a customer base for illegal drugs, and that customer base was then devastated by a second wave of overdoses driven by fentanyl's extreme potency. The Sackler family had no role in the fentanyl wave. That clarification, however, matters less than it might seem. The research is consistent. The majority of people who transition to heroin or illicit fentanyl begin with prescription opioids. Purdue's product was, for hundreds of thousands of people, the beginning of a path that ended in a very different place. Medical systems were unprepared for the scale of what was coming. Primary care physicians, who had been encouraged to think of chronic pain as undertreated, found themselves, in the early 2010s, managing patient populations with severe opioid dependencies they had helped create. Addiction medicine was a thin specialty, inadequately funded and culturally marginalized within American medicine. The idea that addiction was a disease, neurological, treatable, not primarily a moral failure, had been established in research for decades. It had not been established in public understanding or in the infrastructure of healthcare. There were not enough treatment beds. There was not enough access to buprenorphine, the medication-assisted treatment that could manage opioid withdrawal and reduce cravings. In rural communities where the crisis was most acute, there were sometimes no treatment facilities at all. People who recognized their addiction and sought help encountered waiting lists that measured in weeks or months, an eternity when someone is in active withdrawal. The financial architecture of addiction treatment made things worse. Insurance coverage for addiction treatment has historically been poor, particularly in states that didn't expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. Many of the states hit hardest by the opioid crisis. West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee were also states with limited safety nets. This is the full picture that Purdue Pharma's internal teams never had to look at. The company that built the machine did not have to clean up after it. What Purdue did have to manage, increasingly, was litigation. After the 2007 settlement, states, counties, and cities across America began filing lawsuits against Purdue and, eventually, against the Sackler family directly. The legal strategy employed by Purdue and the family's lawyers through most of the 2010s was delay, deny, produce limited documents, challenge jurisdictions, appeal rulings. The litigation process was expensive for everyone involved, and that expense was itself a tool. It wore down plaintiffs, particularly smaller municipalities that lacked the resources for extended federal litigation. The Sacklers had those resources. They used them. What they could not control was journalism. In 2017, Patrick Radden Keefe, published a landmark investigation in The New Yorker that placed the Sackler family, by name with documented detail, at the center of the opioid crisis. The piece drew on court documents, former employee accounts, and a sustained examination of the family's philanthropic activities. It was the first major piece of journalism to make the connection explicit. These museum donors, these hospital patrons, these names on the walls of institutions the cultural elite admired. This family was the family behind the drug. The response was immediate and significant. Activists began appearing at Sackler-named museum wings. The most prominent was Nan Goldin, a photographer who had herself become dependent on OxyContin after a prescription for a wrist injury, and who organized a group called PAIN, Prescription Addiction Intervention Now. They staged die-ins at the Guggenheim, at the Metropolitan, at the Smithsonian, throwing fake prescription bottles into museum rotundas. They demanded that institutions return Sackler donations or remove the family's name from buildings. The cultural institutions faced a choice they had not anticipated when they accepted the money. Some moved quickly. Tate in London removed the Sackler name from its galleries in 2019. The Louvre followed. The Guggenheim announced it would not accept future Sackler donations. Eventually, the Metropolitan Museum of Art began the process of removing the name from its Egyptian wing. These were symbolic acts. They did not return a single dollar to a single victim, but they accomplished something the litigation hadn't managed. They made the family visible, and they connected the philanthropy explicitly to the source of the money. The Sacklers responded to the pressure with a combination of legal threats and private negotiations. Their representatives reached out to museums with what were described, in some accounts, as veiled suggestions that legal action might follow public name removal. Some institutions received letters from the family's attorneys. The pressure didn't work. The names kept coming down. Inside Purdue, the situation was deteriorating. The company had lost the public relations battle it had spent years managing. State attorneys general were coordinating their litigation strategies. In 2018, Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey filed a lawsuit that named individual Sackler family members as defendants, not just the company, but the people. The complaint alleged that they had personally directed the strategies that led to the crisis. The family denied everything, as they always had. Their public statements consistently characterized their involvement in Purdue's operations as ordinary oversight, their withdrawals from the company as normal dividends, and the addiction crisis as a public health problem for which they bore no particular responsibility. The documents told a different story. Among the materials that emerged through discovery, and that the family's lawyers fought to keep sealed, with considerable success for considerable time, were emails showing Richard Sackler personally tracking prescription growth and urging the sales force to push harder. There were communications about managing the abuse problem as a public relations issue rather than a safety crisis. There were discussions about the structure of payments from the company that, in the context of growing litigation risk, read as deliberate asset protection. The gap between the family's public statements and the private documentary record became itself part of the story. By 2019, Purdue Pharma was in bankruptcy proceedings. The family had proposed a settlement that would provide roughly $3 billion from their personal funds to a trust for opioid abatement, money for treatment programs, for naloxone distribution, for the communities that had been devastated. In exchange, they wanted what is called a third-party release, legal protection from future civil lawsuits for individual family members who were not themselves in bankruptcy. Victims' advocates called it a sweetheart deal. They pointed out that the family was retaining the vast majority of the fortune they had extracted from Purdue over the years. They pointed out that the proposed settlement would protect family members from accountability even as it provided them legal immunity. The negotiations continued for years. The numbers shifted, the arguments intensified. And through all of it, the deaths continued, not from OxyContin specifically, which had been reformulated in 2010 to be harder to crush and dissolve, but from the crisis that OxyContin had initiated, and that had long since metastasized into something the company's reformulation could not address. In September 2021, a federal bankruptcy judge named Robert Drain approved a settlement deal for Purdue Pharma that had taken years to negotiate and that satisfied almost no one. Under the terms, the Sackler family would pay approximately $4.5 billion over time to a trust that would fund opioid abatement programs, treatment facilities, naloxone distribution, prevention education. Purdue Pharma would be dissolved and its assets converted into a new company whose profits would also go toward abatement. In exchange, all members of the Sackler family would receive legal immunity from civil lawsuits related to the opioid crisis. No one was going to prison. The family was keeping the majority of their fortune. Estimates of total family wealth ranged from $10 billion to $14 billion, depending on the accounting methodology. The settlement was, in the words of one attorney representing opioid victims, a negotiated resolution of culpability without accountability. The deal was immediately challenged. Multiple state attorneys general opposed it. Victims' families filed objections, the specific provision they challenged. The third-party release protecting family members who had not themselves declared bankruptcy was legally unprecedented. A group of creditors argued that it violated fundamental principles of bankruptcy law, which exists to reorganize insolvent entities, not to provide billionaire families with liability protection in exchange for partial payment. The case went to the Supreme Court. In June 2023, in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that the third-party release was impermissible under federal bankruptcy law. The deal was sent back for renegotiation. It was the most significant legal setback the family had experienced, and it came nearly 3 decades after OxyContin first appeared on pharmacy shelves. A new settlement was eventually reached in 2024. The financial terms were similar, somewhat increased payments from the family, again structured over time. The legal protections were modified to comply with the Supreme Court's ruling, but the practical effect was not dramatically different from what the family had sought in the first place. Individual family members faced no criminal prosecution. The money they had transferred out of Purdue in the years before bankruptcy. The billions moved into personal trusts and offshore structures was largely untouched. The Sacklers were paying. They were not being destroyed. To understand why this outcome was both predictable and enraging requires understanding something about how American law treats corporate wealth versus individual accountability. Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to federal crimes twice, once in 2007 and once in 2020. In the 2020 plea, the company admitted to criminal conduct in its marketing of OxyContin. It had paid illegal kickbacks to doctors and had deliberately misled the DEA about its compliance programs. The admissions were extensive and damaging. The financial penalties were large. No Sackler family member has ever been criminally charged. The Department of Justice considered charges against individual executives and family members in the period leading up to the 2020 settlement. The details of what happened inside those deliberations are not fully public. But what is known is that the DOJ ultimately chose not to pursue criminal charges. The reasons offered were the ones that always appear in these situations: the difficulty of proving criminal intent, the complexity of the corporate structure, the availability of civil remedies. Critics, including former federal prosecutors who have spoken publicly about the case, argue that these explanations are insufficient, that the documentary record, particularly the emails showing Richard Sackler's personal involvement in marketing decisions and his awareness of the abuse crisis, provided material that could support criminal prosecution, that the decision not to charge reflected something else: the difficulty, in practice, of prosecuting wealthy families whose legal teams are excellent and whose corporate structures are deliberately complex. This is not a new story in American law. It is one of the most persistent patterns in white-collar crime. The corporation pleads, pays, and restructures, while the individuals who directed the corporation's decisions retain their freedom. And often, the majority of the wealth those decisions generated. The opioid crisis produced one exception to this pattern. It was not the Sacklers. It was the McKinsey & Company consultants who advised Purdue on its sales strategy during the very period when the crisis was deepening. In 2021, McKinsey agreed to pay $573 million to settle claims brought by state attorneys general. The settlement included the release of internal documents showing that McKinsey had specifically recommended strategies for accelerating OxyContin sales, strategies that targeted high-prescribing doctors and identified methods to counteract what McKinsey called OxyContin fatigue among physicians who had grown cautious about prescribing it. One document showed McKinsey analysis of how to increase opioid prescriptions in specific geographic areas. Another showed discussions about how to respond to overdose statistics in a way that maintained sales momentum. McKinsey apologized. No individual McKinsey consultant faced criminal charges. The pattern held. What the opioid crisis produced, in terms of accountability, was enormous financial settlements and no prison sentences. This outcome has been debated extensively by legal scholars, public health advocates, and victims' families. Some argue that the settlements, the billions paid by Purdue, by McKinsey, by Johnson & Johnson, by the major drug distributors, represent meaningful accountability, that the money is real, and the abatement programs it funds are real. Others argue that financial settlements paid by corporations and wealthy families, structured to preserve those families' essential wealth and freedom, are not accountability in any meaningful sense. The victims' families don't debate this point. For them, the answer is clear. Ed Bish lost his son Eddie to an OxyContin overdose in 2001. Eddie was 18. Ed Bish spent the years afterward organizing other parents, building an advocacy network, attending hearings and depositions and legal proceedings across 2 decades. When the final settlement structure was established, he said publicly that it felt like the legal system had been designed to protect the people who needed the least protection. He was not wrong, exactly. That is not an accusation about this case specifically. It is an observation about the structural conditions under which American corporate law operates. The Sacklers today are a complicated case study in what wealth can and cannot purchase. They could not purchase silence. Journalists and activists and victims' advocates ensured that the family name, once attached to museum wings as a mark of cultural authority, now carries a different resonance in most educated circles. The institutions that removed the name did so because the association had become a liability rather than an honor, a reversal that is almost without precedent in the history of major philanthropy. They could not purchase legal immunity in the form they initially sought. The Supreme Court ruling was real, and it established a principle that will constrain future attempts to use bankruptcy proceedings as a liability shield. What they could purchase, and did, was time. Years of delay through litigation. Years during which billions were withdrawn from the company. Years during which the family's lawyers fought to keep internal documents sealed and largely succeeded, so that the most damaging emails and communications became public only partially and late. In those years, more people died. The number most often cited for prescription opioid deaths specifically, the wave directly tied to OxyContin and its successors, is roughly 247,000 between 1999 and 2019, according to CDC data. The broader figure, which includes deaths from all opioids, including heroin and illicit fentanyl, is the 500,000 number that has become standard in public reporting on the crisis. Both numbers continue to grow. The fentanyl crisis, which the pharmaceutical opioid wave helped to create by establishing large populations of opioid-dependent people who later transitioned to illicit drugs, is now its own emergency. More than 80,000 Americans die from opioid overdoses annually, with the vast majority of those deaths involving illicitly manufactured fentanyl. This wave has less to do with the Sacklers or Purdue directly, and much to do with the structural conditions in addiction medicine, in mental health care, in economic distress, that the prescription opioid crisis both exposed and worsened. The Sackler family's philanthropic legacy is in active dissolution. The Sackler name has been removed or is in the process of removal from dozens of institutions globally. The Metropolitan Museum of Art completed the removal from its Egyptian wing in 2023. The American Natural History Museum followed. Tufts University, which accepted millions from the family for its medical school. Oxford University, which had a Sackler Institute. The University of Edinburgh. The process has been uneven. Some smaller institutions have moved more slowly, citing the complexity of gift agreements. But the direction is clear. The Sackler Gallery at the Smithsonian, Arthur's original donation, the one that began the family's major philanthropic ascent in the 1970s, retained its name through years of controversy, sheltered in part by the complexity of renaming a federally operated institution. In 2023, that changed. The Smithsonian announced that the gallery would be renamed. The process of removing the name from the physical building began quietly. Arthur Sackler, who died in 1987, who built the advertising playbook that his brothers applied to OxyContin, who never personally directed OxyContin's marketing. Nonetheless, the figure whose name came down from the most symbolic institution. The arc of the family's story reached back to its beginning and removed even that marker. What remains is the money. The Sacklers retain a fortune that, even after settlements and legal costs, places individual family members among the wealthiest people in America. Richard Sackler lives quietly. The family members who served on Purdue's board have, in public, maintained their denials of personal wrongdoing, while accepting the settlement terms that constitute the closest thing to accountability the legal system produced. There is a final data point that puts the whole story into perspective. In 2019, the year Purdue Pharma declared bankruptcy, OxyContin had generated approximately $35 billion in revenue since its launch in 1995. The Sackler family had withdrawn roughly $10 to $12 billion of that over the years. The total amount the family has committed to opioid settlements across all proceedings is in the range of $6 billion paid over time from a fortune that remains substantial after those payments. The math is not comfortable. It suggests that the economic logic of what the Sacklers did was sound, at least from the perspective of personal financial outcomes. They built a machine. They ran it for as long as they could. They extracted what they could before it was stopped, and they settled for less than they made. The drug didn't kill them. It didn't imprison them. It made them extraordinarily wealthy. The accountability that followed, real in some ways, inadequate in others, did not fundamentally alter that basic outcome. This is not a story about a family that was caught and destroyed. It is a story about a family that was caught and managed the consequences. The management was imperfect. The damage to their reputation is permanent. The financial cost is significant. But the fundamental structure of the outcome, wealthy family profits from product that causes mass casualties, pays fines, retains fortune, faces no criminal prosecution, is not unique to the Sacklers. It is a template. It has been applied before and will be applied again. The question the opioid crisis ultimately poses is not about the Sacklers specifically. It is about the conditions that make this outcome possible, the legal structures that treat corporate crime differently from individual crime, the cultural systems that convert wealth into respectability and respectability into protection, the regulatory frameworks that allow pharmaceutical companies to make safety claims on thin evidence and face consequences only after the evidence of harm is too large to ignore. Those conditions are still in place. The Sackler name is coming down from the museum walls. The family is paying, slowly, into funds for communities that are still rebuilding. The dead are still counted, and the counting is not finished. And, somewhere right now, in a boardroom or a research facility or a marketing meeting, someone is looking at a drug and a market and a population that is already vulnerable and thinking about what it could be worth. That is where this story ends. Not with a family. With a system. The Sacklers didn't build the system. They just knew how to use it better than almost anyone before them. And the system is still there. What that system looks like up close, not in the abstractions of legal theory or public health statistics, but in the specific texture of individual lives, requires a different kind of accounting. The communities where OxyContin did the most concentrated damage were not random. They were places that shared certain characteristics, economically distressed, often rural, with high rates of physical labor and workplace injury. Places where a doctor's prescription for pain carried particular weight because there was no other framework available. No robust mental health infrastructure, no addiction treatment capacity, no employee assistance programs of the kind that exist in professional class employment. Places where the pill was often the only thing on offer. Mingo County, West Virginia. McDowell County, Scioto County, Ohio, Pike County, Kentucky, Johnson County, Tennessee. These places show up repeatedly in the data. They show up repeatedly in the oral histories collected by journalists and researchers over the past 2 decades. They are places where the Purdue sales model worked especially well, in the grim sense of worked, where high-prescribing doctors were abundant, where patient populations were large and economically vulnerable, where there was no organized resistance to the marketing, because no one was watching closely enough to organize one. In these places, the settlements and the legal proceedings and the Supreme Court decisions and the name removals from museum walls happened in a different register entirely. The abstractions of white-collar accountability discourse don't translate easily to a county where 1 in 5 residents has lost someone to an overdose. The debate about whether financial settlements represent meaningful accountability matters less when the settlement money, however large in aggregate, has yet to meaningfully alter the daily reality of communities still processing the aftermath of a 20-year catastrophe. The abatement funds are real. The programs they finance, expanded treatment access, naloxone distribution, peer recovery support, are doing work that would not happen otherwise. In some counties, overdose death rates have declined in recent years, and some of that decline can be traced to programmatic interventions funded in part by settlement money. This is not nothing. It is worth stating clearly, but the ratio is off. The scale of what was lost, in lives, in family structures, in economic capacity, in accumulated community health, vastly exceeds what any settlement can restore. You cannot pay back a generation. You cannot settle a demographic scar that shows up in every census, in every school enrollment figure, in every county health survey for the next 30 years. The money helps at the margins of a problem that is not marginal. This is the specific cruelty of the economic logic at work here. The Sacklers made $10 to $12 billion. The communities that bore the cost of that extraction will spend decades rebuilding, with resources that represent a fraction of what was taken. The accounting is not symmetric. It was never going to be symmetric. That asymmetry is the story. What it produced in those communities, beyond the deaths and the addiction rates, was something harder to quantify, a kind of institutional exhaustion. A worn-down relationship with the idea that the formal structures of American law and American medicine were designed to protect people like them. The people who attended the bankruptcy hearings, who submitted written testimonies describing what they had lost, who drove to federal courthouses and sat through procedural arguments about bankruptcy law technicalities that most of them had no framework to fully pass. Those people were told, over and over again by well-meaning advocates, that their participation mattered, that bearing witness was meaningful, that the legal process, however slow and imperfect, was working. Some of them stopped believing that. The ones who kept showing up anyway, past the point where belief was sustaining them, are a category of American civic life that doesn't get named often enough. People who continued to engage with institutions that had failed them, not because they trusted those institutions, but because the alternative, withdrawal, silence, the ceding of the field, was worse. Ed Bish is one of those people. There are thousands more. The failure of the criminal justice system to prosecute individuals in the opioid crisis is not an isolated phenomenon, but its particular shape in this case reveals something specific about the relationship between pharmaceutical corporations and prosecutorial culture in the United States. The 2007 Purdue plea deal, the first criminal guilty plea, was entered by Purdue Frederick Company, a Purdue subsidiary, rather than Purdue Pharma itself, a distinction that limited the legal consequences. 3 executives pleaded guilty to misbranding charges and paid personal fines. The fines were large by ordinary standards. They were not large relative to the compensation those executives had received, or the scale of the harm the misbranding had contributed to. They faced no prison time. The U.S. attorney who led that prosecution, John Brownlee of the Western District of Virginia, later said publicly that pressure from Maine Justice, the Maine Department of Justice office in Washington, had complicated the case, that there were discussions about the scope of charges, about what level of individual accountability was appropriate, about how aggressive a posture the government should take against a major pharmaceutical company. He suggested that the outcome was softer than his office had sought. This account has been disputed. The dynamics of large white-collar prosecutions are always complex, and the internal deliberations are never fully visible. What is visible is the outcome. A 2007 settlement that was, at the time, described as a landmark corporate accountability moment, and that, in retrospect, looks more like an early signal that the family and company had found a navigable path through the legal system. The pattern repeated in 2020. Larger fines, more extensive admissions, no criminal charges against individuals. Between those two moments, approximately 200,000 Americans died from prescription opioid overdoses. The DOJ's institutional culture around pharmaceutical prosecutions is not incidental to this story. It is structural. The revolving door between regulatory agencies, the DOJ, and the legal firms that represent pharmaceutical companies is well documented. The people who prosecute these cases are, professionally and socially, adjacent to the people who defend them. This does not mean that prosecutors are corrupt or captured in any simple sense. It means that the institutional imagination about what accountability looks like, what charges are appropriate, what outcomes are achievable, what risks are worth taking in a complex litigation, is shaped by a professional culture with particular assumptions built in. One of those assumptions, stated plainly, is that senior executives of major corporations who did not personally sign fraudulent documents are difficult to prosecute successfully. That the chain of knowledge and intent required to establish criminal liability runs through corporate structures designed, among other things, to diffuse that liability. That the jury is uncertain, the evidence complex, the defense well-funded, and the reputational cost of a failed prosecution real. These are genuine concerns. They are also, critics argue, concerns that happen to produce outcomes convenient for the people whose conduct is being evaluated. There is a counter-history that runs alongside the official one. The history of cases where the DOJ decided the concerns were worth overcoming, where it pursued criminal charges against individuals at major corporations and won, where it decided that the evidence was strong enough, the conduct egregious enough, the public interest significant enough to justify the risk. Those cases exist. They are less common than critics would like. The opioid case was not one of them. What accountability did arrive came from places the formal legal system did not anticipate. State attorneys general, operating without the institutional constraints of the federal DOJ, pursued cases more aggressively and with more publicity. Investigative journalists obtained and published internal Purdue documents that the company fought to keep sealed, putting details before the public that the legal proceedings alone might never have made available. Former employees provided testimony that shaped the public record even when it could not be used in ways that produced criminal convictions. The public record that exists now, the emails, the board presentations, the sales training materials, the internal communications about the addiction crisis, is damning in its specificity. It shows people who knew, people who made calculations about what the knowledge required of them and concluded, repeatedly, that it required less than it did. Richard Sackler's emails are the most often cited. He tracked sales figures with attention to detail. He received reports about abuse rates. He received reports about overdose clusters in specific regions. He wrote responses. The responses were not responses of a man who did not understand what was happening. They were responses of a man who understood what was happening and was making choices about how to proceed anyway. Those emails did not produce a criminal charge. They produced a settlement. The distinction is the story. In the years since the worst of the crisis began to surface, there has been a recurring debate in public health circles and legal scholarship about what the opioid epidemic should change, what systemic reforms would reduce the likelihood of something similar happening again. The proposals are various. Stricter FDA approval standards for pain medications with high abuse potential. Requirements for independent safety monitoring not funded by the manufacturers. Stronger and earlier DEA intervention when prescription data shows anomalous patterns. Reforms to bankruptcy law to prevent the third-party liability shield the Sacklers attempted to use. Structural limits on pharmaceutical marketing to prescribers. Expanded criminal liability for corporate officers in cases of mass consumer harm. Some of these reforms have been partially implemented. Most have not. The FDA has strengthened some warning label requirements. Some states have passed legislation limiting prescribing of high-dose opioids. The Supreme Court has constrained the specific bankruptcy mechanism the Sacklers used. But the deeper architecture, the basic conditions under which a company can market a dangerous product aggressively, profit enormously, and face consequences only after the harm becomes impossible to ignore, remains largely intact. This is the argument that the opioid crisis, for all the attention it generated, for all the billions in settlements and the legal proceedings, and the congressional hearings, and the documentaries, and the memoirs, and the journalism, did not fundamentally alter. The framework that made it possible is still the framework. The next crisis is already inside that framework. It may not look like OxyContin. It probably won't. The specific mechanism, a reformulated opioid marketed as abuse-resistant, sold through a network of sales representatives armed with studies that turned out to be misleading, was particular to a moment and a family and a drug. But the conditions that allowed it, the regulatory gap between approval and real-world safety monitoring, the cultural authority of the prescription that made patients and doctors both less likely to question pharmaceutical company claims, the legal structures that made corporate liability manageable and individual criminal liability essentially unavailable for senior executives, those conditions persist. They will be exploited again. Perhaps they are being exploited right now, in a category that hasn't yet produced a crisis visible enough to generate this kind of reckoning. The crisis, when it comes, will generate its own proceedings, its own settlements, its own journalism, its own names coming down from walls. And the system will still be there when it's over. The Sackler name is coming down from the museum walls. The family is paying, slowly, into funds for communities that are still rebuilding. The dead are still counted, and the counting is not finished. And somewhere right now, in a boardroom or a research facility or a marketing meeting, someone is looking at a drug and a market and a population that is already vulnerable and thinking about what it could be worth. That is where this story ends. Not with a family, with a system. The Sacklers didn't build the system. They just knew how to use it better than almost anyone before them. And the system is still there.